Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Talking Numbers, our special Talking Numbers Property Plus series. If you're joining us for the second of our podcast series, you're not quite sure who I am. My name is Paul Jansz. If you've heard our first one, we hope you enjoyed our first podcast in this new series of Talking Numbers, where we're delving into a little bit more about probably what most Australians love to invest in or buy as their family home. It's one of those things that everybody loves, and we're talking about property and the property industry. This series is brought to you by Virtual Financial and Jay Anderson Property. And I've got Jay Anderson on our Talking Numbers podcast. Over the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to be chatting to everything about property. Today, we'll look at rent vesting, and probably this is one of the key things. We gave a bit of a tease to this. Jay, welcome back. How are you?
Yeah, well, thanks. And looking forward to another episode.
Yeah, brilliant. Mate, in our first podcast, we spoke a little bit, we went into a little bit more detail about some of the things that, and the numbers side we touched on, whether it was tangible assets. We spoke about wealth. We spoke about 9.95 trillion is invested in residential property here in Australia, and we've got some other numbers to share. You shared some fantastic things. Are you okay to give us a little bit of a recap of the first podcast, let's say?
Yeah, so I guess we just touched on why Australians love property. Little bit of talking about, I guess, some of the common mistakes people have made, and just a bit of a snapshot and insight into investing in property. One thing that I thought we might tack onto the end of last podcast is I guess looking at why people invest in property. We spoke about capital growth and stuff like that. And a few years ago, I actually did a bit of an analysis of compound growth rates across all the capital cities from 1970, and I've done it until 2021. So what's interesting is the average across the 8 capital cities annual growth rate is 8.47%. From 1970 to 2021, the average across the 8 capital cities is 8.47%. So why that's interesting, and I guess I give you a bit of a reference, a compound growth rate of 7.2% means that the property doubles in value every 10 years. So 1970 to 2021, it's nearly 8.5%. 7.2% would equal a property double in value every 10 years. What I need to now say is, however, in saying that, a much more realistic number in today's day and age, and a number we use in a more conservative long-term forecasting, is an annual growth rate of 6%. So if you're trying to map out a bit of a long-term forecasting on your property portfolio, obviously subject to what you own and where it is, but a conservative number to use is 6%.
So annual growth, as in capital growth rate of 6%.
Correct.
Okay, good, and fantastic numbers again. And this is the great thing, I think, whether you're in the financial services, financial planning, like a Virtual Financial, or you're in the accounting industry, the value of compounded growth is phenomenal, and that's one of the great things to continue to think about. And that's we'll go back a step, and I'll let Jay cover off some key things about himself as well. And I think, again, everyone listening to our second podcast in this series has got the ability to go back to the first as well and listen to some of the key areas that Jay just mentioned and touched on, sort of whether it's some of the mistakes or whether it's some of the key numbers he spoke about as well. And we've got some graphs we're going to attach to these sorts of podcasts. So you've got some imagery to go with the auditory, which is what you're listening to right now. So, mate, I might just go back a step and maybe tell us about why you got into property. Obviously, you've been in it for a while. We spoke about in the first episode about your own balanced portfolio. What drove you towards this industry in property, investing in property?
Yeah, so my family's been in commercial property since the late 1950s. So ever since I was a young kid, I always had this kind of interest and fascination around property. But I bought my first investment property in 2010. It was a rundown, and I say that in a certainly not understating it. It was very rundown. Rundown 2-bedroom apartment in Potts Point in Sydney. my wife, or fiance at the time, we fully renovated the property, did it all ourselves, which was stressful but great experience to do. Post renovation, we got it revalued, and we kind of went, "Oh wow, that was easy! Look at all the money we just made." So, as many amateurs and beginners do, we came out of the first one thinking we were experts. Thought, "Oh, we've got this down packed. This is easy." I then spent the next year trying to buy the next property and attending, open inspections every single weekend, doing what I thought was the right research at the time. I was, looking at comparable sales, working out renovation budget. I remember going into properties with a clipboard and kind of writing down notes on what's wrong with the property and, trying to calculate post-renovation value, etc. But we just kept missing out on properties. And I guess after 12 months, I started feeling overwhelmed and a bit beaten down. And I had that light bulb moment. Some people probably said, why did it take 12 months? But I had that light bulb moment of realizing that I wasn't an expert. And if I want to become a successful property investor, and my wife and I, we really need to learn what successful investors do. Professionals they surround themselves with, and also dedicate as much time, energy, and resources that I could in learning absolutely everything there was about how the property market works. And I'm a very, very analytical person. So I started a project of basically going back to where I felt I could get reliable data from, and that was 1970. And I started tracking median house prices, population growth data, infrastructure spending and projects, interest rates, unemployment rates in each capital city, and trying to basically map out what was happening in each market at that time, and try to identify any patterns to see if there was any correlation between specific data and property price movements. From then on, it basically became a full-blown obsession. Attending seminars, courses, reading books, podcasts, surrounding myself with investors, meeting investors. And then I started building what I call my A team. So I had a property-focused accountant, a financial planner who was open to property, experienced property investment mortgage broker. And then the other profession that kept coming up with successful investors that I was talking to was buyer's agents. And at that stage, I didn't even know what a buyer's agent was. So from that point on, I actually started using buyer's agents for my own purchases. So I did, I think it was 5 or 6 property purchases with buyer's agents. And then the bug had, well and truly got me, and I just became full-blown obsessed with it. Then I started bringing in commercial property into my residential portfolio. And then from about 2012 onwards, I started having family, friends, colleagues seeing what I was doing with my property portfolio and started asking me questions going, how are you doing this? And can I do it? And where do I start? And so I started sharing some of the markets I was looking in, the data I was looking at, making introductions to the different professionals I was using, and started kind of building these close relationships with these people and helping them along their journey, to just kind of giving insights into what I was doing. And then, fast forward a couple of years and turned the passion into a career and completed all the, necessary qualifications, licenses, and basically the rest is history. And now I've got my own business where I help other investors do what I do.
Brilliant. And I think that's the great thing to all of our listeners. If you're listening to that, I suppose if you're passionate about something, you're going to love what you do. And when you love what you do, not only does it come easier, but you want to absorb more and more and more. And that little hobby can turn into a lot more. And you've obviously created a fantastic business out of doing what you're doing. Becoming the expert in something is about having the data and the knowledge, like whether it's our accounting network or it's our financial advising, financial planning network. Obviously, you move into different directions and you go and get your qualifications and you learn and you continue to learn. And a lot of it's driven by data. So that's what's the great thing about this whole new series that we're doing on Talking Numbers Property Plus is exactly that. So I'm sure everyone listening to this can actually resonate with the way that you've gone ahead and built that, which is fantastic. I love the fact that, you spoke about and you touched on back then you didn't know what a buyer's agent was. And funnily enough, one of my friends is also a buyer's agent. And we're going to touch on that. We're going to go into a little bit more about what is a buyer's agent and the benefits. We're going to do that, I think, in episode 6. So look out for it, or you can probably go forward and have a look at it if you're depending on when you're listening to this, I suppose. It will be in the series. So we're going to touch on that in a fair bit of detail. Now, mate, given the talking numbers is aimed at the account industry, and a lot of us do have superannuation, whether it's a self-managed super fund or as an industry fund where our employers contribute. I think it's now 10.5% as it's just gone up from 1 July. We sometimes get drawn into these, I'll call it hype areas, and it's an interesting one because we can talk about tech stocks, tech shares. The market's interesting. It's just corrected probably in the last couple of weeks. You can talk about crypto, and obviously some people have made a lot of money and others have lost a lot of money with crypto. How does property tend to perform over a 5 or 10 year period when buying with the right numbers?
Yeah, so I guess touched on this a little bit earlier on, but I guess the numbers we use for long-term forecasting at the moment is about 6% annual growth rate. On top of that, you've then got the rental yield, which then gives us our total return. Property's not for people wanting to make a quick buck or make a lot of money in a very short period of time. Obviously, it can be done, but property is a long-term play, and I think history shows us and tells us that it's a very stable and rewarding long-term investment vehicle. In terms of long-term growth rates and stuff, I think in the intro we spoke about 8.47% being the average across the 8 capital cities from 1970 to 2001. Where it's interesting is you're not going to see that number year on year consistently. You'll have years that are in the red, in the negative, other years where it's sitting quite stagnant, and then you're going to have stronger years. So it's important to look at it over a longer period of time, a 10, 20 year window, rather than looking at 2, 3, 4 year windows. So in that research and study that I did of tracking median house prices 1970 to 2021, I actually broke it down into 10-year windows as well. And it was quite interesting to see how each capital city performed against each other in different 10-year windows, where there's this thought always around Sydney and Melbourne, they're the best performing markets long term and whatnot. Where it's interesting is you can actually bring in some of these regional areas, and I'll give you one. So Bendigo, regional Victoria, over the last 20 years has actually outperformed 6 of the 8 capital cities in terms of capital growth, which
interesting.
Is amazing, right? People always think, you need to buy in Sydney, or if you want the long-term capital growth. But a lot of these regional areas over a long period of time have actually far outperformed some of our major capital cities. So it's not just about buying in a capital city, it's about following that research data and making the decisions that way.
It's interesting, isn't it? Like you're right, and I think that's what it comes down to, isn't it? It comes down to not buying emotionally, which we spoke about in episode 1 as well, and it's about making sure that the 9 times out of 10, and you might correct me, it might be higher than 9 times out of 10. The data doesn't lie, so you've got reliable information that you can work with if it fits in with, again, what we spoke about in episode 1 was your plan. So making sure you have the right strategic plan to why and where, and the data won't lie. And that's the great thing about it. Mate, let's talk about rent investing or rent vesting. What is it? Let's go into a little bit about detail about that.
Yeah, so rent vesting is a strategy where you rent a property in the chosen suburb that you actually want to live, and you use your money to purchase an investment property in another suburb or even another state where the numbers stack up for your budget goals and investment strategy. So, I think historically there's this thing of rent money is dead money.
Yes.
But if you can't afford to buy in the market in the area you want to live, or in the city you want to live, it makes sense. Rent where you want to live, but use that money and go invest elsewhere. So that's essentially what the strategy of rent vesting is, and it's becoming very popular with, I guess, younger buyers, especially in some of our more expensive capital cities.
Yeah, look, I look. It's a philosophy that I've lived by for a very long time. In terms of, you can always rent where you want to live, but you can sometimes not necessarily buy where you want to live. So I don't personally. I don't believe in the rent is dead, because it's all about lifestyle. It's all about position. It's the fact that, again, sharing a little bit about me, I live across the road from the school that my three boys go to. So as far as convenience is concerned, I'm 7 minutes from the city. That's what it's about to me and my lifestyle. Where I've got investments working for me elsewhere. So I'm 100% with that thought process. But I think a lot of people. This is the great part about these sorts of educational messages, I suppose, that people can actually start thinking about. It's like, well, yeah, well, and you sometimes get into this, and it's going to be an interesting stage probably over the next, I don't know, we'll say till Christmas this year, where people maybe feeling that pinch where they borrowed a lot more money at lower interest rates, and they may be doubling over the next, or even more than doubling over the next 3-4 months, and they'll feel the pinch, and then that causes cash flow issues. So it's an interesting stage where people need to make that decision of what to do, isn't it?
Yeah. No, you spot on.
So why do people end up? Let's go into why do people end up making a decision to buying their home? Let's say buying your own home, and I suppose, do you need to do that? So let's break that down for probably under the rent vesting, I suppose. That decision, it's a bit of an emotional one. Sometimes can be driven by your wife or your husband as well. So why do you end up making that decision to buy your own home?
I think for, if we take a segment of the market, let's say a certain demographic, let's say that the younger generation, typically I think it's about access to funds is number one. Can they actually afford a deposit on a house where they want to live, in the city where they want to live? That normally is the first thing that triggers that conversation of going, well, are we buying our own home, or are we going to rent vest? The decision, I think, and I think if we look back to our parents' generation, our grandparents' generation, it's been very much about go to school, get a good education, go to university, get a good job, buy a house, spend the next 30 years trying to pay it off.
Yes,
it's the thought to some of the older generation of rent vesting just seems ludicrous, seems crazy. So I think we're driven a lot by our upbringing, and it's very that whole white picket fence, story, the Australian dream of owning your own property. So that drives a lot of people's decision into buying your own home versus property investing.
Yeah, I think it's and look, I suppose the times are quite different. If I look at the even the area that I live in, and the people across the road from me is a good example, where they've been married for 55 years, they've had their property for 55 years. It's on a massive block, and the increase in value would be enormous. Where it's an interesting whether or not you can get that in 2022 going into 2023. It's just a really interesting. Back then you're buying properties for $100,000, and yeah, this property across the road might be worth 3 at the moment. But will you, if you're buying at 3, will it go to, I don't know, I can't even do the numbers on that one in terms of percentage. Will it increase by that much? I don't think so. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, and I guess another thing, taking a little bit of tangent and away from that just for a moment, just thinking when, I guess, the prior generations bought a property, a lot of the times it was for their forever home.
Yes.
They were going to buy there and stay there forever. But the current generation who are, moving into the property market, mid 20s to kind of early 30s, a lot of the times you ask them, and I have this conversation with buyers like this all the time, is, all right, if you go buy your own home, is that going to be your forever home? And often the answer is, oh no, this is just a stepping stone. Would only be here for maybe 3 to 5 years. So I think that has been a big shift and a big change.
Different mindset. Different mindset.
So then I normally say is, okay, well, if it's only going to be 3 or 5 years, does it make sense? And it's going to be a stepping stone. Doesn't it make sense to maybe look at investing for that 5 years, or whatever it may be, and look at just trying to get as much capital growth as possible, rather than buying a 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom apartment in a capital city that it's not somewhere where you want to live forever anyway, and taking that view. So I think that's been a big shift over the last number of years. But in terms of what you could buy a property for, I did a bit of an exercise of going back and looking at properties my parents had bought before I was born and stuff like that, and you have a look at what they paid and what it would be worth now, and even properties that I looked at buying. When I spoke about my own property investing journey, that 12 months after our first purchase, where I was looking at properties, I remember saying no to properties over over $5,000, going, nah, they want too much money, and walking away from it. Going back and looking at what that property or what those properties are worth now, it's that $5,000 was a drop in the sand. Drop in the ocean. Sorry.
And I think you can also fall into this trap sometimes that, I'll share something that I did. That first property that I bought for $129,000 maybe 20 years ago. $129,000. It's like, what the hell?
That's stamp duty now.
That's exactly right. Now I know for a fact that recently sold for $1.1 million.
Wow.
So exactly. But what we tend to do is we tend to go, well, actually, we'll sell this one to get into a bigger one, and we'll take that stepping stone. So we want to have a smaller mortgage, and so you sell that instead of hanging on to it, I suppose. It's an interesting, but that's that mindset, isn't it? If what you don't know, you don't know.
Yeah.
So, mate, let's cover off, and I know we're going to cover some of that future stuff in these, exactly what we just spoke about it in some of the stuff we're going to talk about in the future. But let's run through rent vesting, pros and cons. Let's do a quick summary before we wrap up this episode.
Yeah. Probably going to answer it too. We'll go through some pros and cons, but I also want to run through, I guess, that thought process of the advantages of doing it, which is going to fall into the pros. But
Fantastic.
give a bit of a case study, I guess. I've got a client who's now in her early 30s, single female, wasn't able to afford to buy a property in Sydney at the time. Just not possible, not even close. So she made the decision to rent vest and ended up buying an investment property interstate. That property, fortunately enough, grew in value quite substantially in a fairly short period of time, to the point where she was actually able to extract equity from that property to use towards purchasing another investment property. Yes. And then 12 months after that, bought another property. So she's now got 3 investment properties that she owns, and she's now actually in a position where she can sell them to go and buy a property in Sydney. So without that rent vesting strategy, there's no way she would have ever been able to save enough if she just focused on saving money to try and save up to buy a property in Sydney. She wouldn't have been in that position now. So that is, I guess, a bit of a good example of rent vesting and how it can actually help people. If they don't have the budget, they can still use those funds in other markets, in other states, to help them achieve what they wanted to achieve. And her goal was, to be able to one day afford to buy a property in Sydney, and she's, about to go ahead and do that. So I guess that's that's a bit of a case study, an example of the pros, but
yes,
summarizing some of them, like you touched on, lifestyle is a big thing. So being able to rent where you want to live, there's a lot of compelling reasons behind that in terms of local amenities, distance to work, lifestyle, safety, security, and lifestyles. It's a very important thing. There was a study done a few years ago about happiness and commute time to work, which that's just such a simple thing. But if you're within a 25-minute commute to work versus an hour, you're a happier person. There's less stress and all the rest of it. So little lifestyle things like that, or being closer to family or your kids or whatever it may be, that can actually have a big impact. So it's important. The lifestyle component is important. Another pro, and I guess looking at that case study as well, is about that wealth building element. Being able to use your budget, your borrowing capacity in a better way, getting your money to work harder for you over a period of time to help build your wealth, and I guess making decisions based purely on investment rather than buying a house where you want to live, is using that money with the sole view of wealth creation and investment and returns. Cost savings, which is an interesting one, which is not always thought about. So you think if you're renting a property, your landlord is responsible for maintenance, sometimes repairs, upkeep, insurance, council rates, body corporate fees, strata, stamp duty, all sorts of stuff, which as a tenant, you're not having to pay. And where it gets interesting is the more expensive property that you rent, the more it actually makes sense to rent vest. And bear with me here, but imagine once you get to, I guess, more premium suburbs or more premium properties, it's often that you're actually able to afford to rent that property, but you wouldn't be able to afford to buy that property. So in terms of lifestyle and location, you can actually end up renting a property that you wouldn't actually afford to be able to own. So as long as you're investing that money elsewhere, it can make a lot of sense. And then I guess from, we spoke about the things that the landlord are responsible for if you're a renter, and some of the listeners are probably thinking, well, if you're investing elsewhere, then you've got those responsibilities as a landlord for your investment property. But the difference is when it's an investment property, you get those tax benefits where you can claim a lot of those costs and those deductions for holding and owning the property. Where if you owned your own home, those costs are not tax deductible. So that's a bit of an interesting one there.
I agree.
The cons of rent vesting, what's the negative side? I think the big one, and I think this would probably be on your mind or many accountants' minds, is the loss of access to capital gains tax exemption, which is a big one, right? It's big. If you've got your principal place of residence, so your own home, carries a full exemption on capital gains tax. Where if it's an investment property, then you've got capital gains tax when you go to sell the property. So that's certainly a big one. But as I guess the argument to that is if you're making a decision and you're making money and you're investing somewhere where you're going to get better growth and better return, or there's a scenario where you don't actually need to sell the investment property, like that you touched on earlier, you might be able to get growth out of that investment property, leverage against it, deposit on the family home or whatever it may be. You don't always have to sell. And a big one, and this is probably one of the biggest hurdles to getting into rent investing, is what we call the emotional cost. Missing out on that great Australian dream of owning your own home. And I guess that the perception from society as well about, oh, you rent, and sometimes there can be a perception about that, and when you say, oh yeah, but I own investment properties, you can get this weird look sometimes of going,
yeah,
why would you do that? It doesn't make sense. But they don't understand the reasons behind it and all the rest of it. So that's certainly a thing, especially for, let's say a newly married couple or whatever it may be, that they want a place that they can actually call their home and stick artwork and pictures of the kids up on the walls and all the rest of it. So yeah, the emotional cost is a big thing. But that's where it's important to take a couple of steps back and look at the bigger picture and go, well, what are our goals? What are we actually trying to achieve? And
very true.
What will help us get there?
And I think, like you mentioned in the first episode, when we're talking about goals and that strategic plan, if you're single today and then you meet someone in 2 or 3 years' time, it's important to do that together. Yep. So, that's just my experience of making sure that, you're both on the same page and bringing that strategic plan together, or going back and revisiting it, because you might have bought your first property being single, and then you you're considering a second one, or whatever you're considering, is, well, let's revisit that and make sure that we are aligned with our strategy to how we're going to build our property portfolio, which is just as important.
Spot on. It's very, very important. And, there's doing a strategic plan or a strategic document and putting it in the bottom drawer and never looking at it again is, complete waste of time, because, as you said, your personal circumstances, your financial circumstances can change, the property market can change. So it's really important to do, either 6 monthly or an annual review of not only the strategy, the plan, but what's been happening in your own life as well. Do we need to make changes? So it's important to continually review kind of where you're at and your goals and what you're trying to achieve.
Correct. And that's sort of one of the great things about a self-managed super fund, of making sure you've got that plan in place, because, you've got your funds in your self-managed super fund and you've got a plan of how those funds are going to be invested for the future. So again, that's the great thing about sometimes the self-managed fund, that you need to have that plan in place, but there's no reason why every single one of us shouldn't have that plan in place and continually revisit it, whether it be 6 monthly or 12 monthly, as Jay just mentioned, which is brilliant. Mate, let's just as a little teaser, as we look to wrap up our episode number 2 of Talking Numbers Property Plus, let's give us a bit of a teaser of what we're going to talk about in our next episode.
Yeah, next episode is going to be a fun one. We're going to be talking about what's happening in property markets around Australia. So certainly interesting time at the moment in some property markets. So yeah, just going to do a bit of a snapshot and maybe a bit of a deep dive into certain areas on what's happening and what the outlook looks like.
Brilliant. Mate, thanks again for joining us. To all of you that are listening, hope you enjoyed what we had to share. Again, if you've been in the car, great listening to this, but I also love listening to my podcast, certainly when they mean something and they've got the numbers behind it. I love going back and then revisiting that with some notes and really understanding what the actual message behind it meant. And that's what this is all about. So we hope you've enjoyed our episode number 2 of this great new series. Jay, thank you. And I look forward to chatting to you in our next episode of Talking Numbers Property Plus.
Likewise, looking forward to it. Cheers.
Talk soon.